You're listening to The Journey with Ellie and Erin. Join us every week as we talk about all the things woo, wise and wonderful with our guests and have the bigger, braver, bolder conversations that women should be having so that we can be the change the world needs.
Hello and welcome to The Journey. You will be noticing that there is a different voice introducing it today, and that's because I'm in charge. Yes, it is Ellie in charge today, and that is because I have actually got the privilege today of interviewing my dear friend and business partner, Erin. We thought it would be really like a real opportunity to dive into where we are in our lives, what we're thinking, some of the journey that has brought us to this particular space, and just share some of that with the listeners. So without further ado, I am going to jump straight in and say, good morning, my friend. How do you feel the fact that I am in charge and I am interviewing you today?
I don't want to say hostile takeover, but no, I'm weary and excited and nervous and all the things, actually. I love the conversations that we have. They're always rich and nourishing and come from a place of genuine curiosity about each other and about the world. So, I'm looking forward to the conversation. A little bit like, what's going to come up? But we'll get there.
Awesome. Well, I think probably the first question to kick off with really is, how did you get to where you are today? You know, what is a potted history of Erin Hodgson, and how did she, what is her journey? Like, what are the key highlights, if you were, or lowlights, that have got you to where you are today, to be the fabulous person that I know you to be? What has brought you to this space?
Wow. Good question. I'm a child of the 80s. I grew up in the 1980s. I had my teen years in the 1990s. So that probably shaped a wee bit of who I am, I think. I grew up in rural New Zealand in a very traditional nuclear family, large extended family. Was fortunate enough to have, good connection with my extended family growing up. My mum and dad are both one of six. So it was always big family gatherings. They were always very connected. And I was lucky enough to have great-grandparents and grandparents present in my life my great-grandmother passed when I was at the end of my teens. So, in that respect, my entire childhood, I had generations of support and love and guidance and wisdom to draw upon. Being a child, I'm the eldest of three. I have a younger sister and a younger brother. And, there's lots of things about that have shaped me as well. My, seeing how my sister was treated differently to I was, seeing how my brother was treated differently to how I was. Those sorts of things, I think, play a role in who you become. And then, growing up in a fairly, I don't want to say right wing, central right in terms of politics and belief systems and all of that sort of thing. It's rural, so it's very much, built on religion and, that sort of farming background and all of that sort of stuff that comes on. And then being this, I guess, somewhat rebellious, somewhat unsure who she is kind of human, it led to some difficult stuff. As a late teen, I struggled with my identity. I struggled with addiction. I struggled with mental health and self-harm and that sort of stuff. And then I went and moved overseas for a little bit, moved to Australia and spent a little bit of time over there. And kind of that was the time, I guess, where it became really clear to me who I wanted to be and how I wanted to be. In as much as I knew it wasn't what I was at the time. I don't know if I necessarily had clarity around what the end result looked like, but certainly it was clear to me that where I was and who I was wasn't for me. So when I came back to New Zealand for my sister's wedding, I decided to stay and got myself a corporate job and played the game for a bit. Still struggled with addiction and still struggled with mental health through that time. And and then at 25, nearly 25, I met my now wife, and there was something about her that changed everything, and nothing specific that I can point my finger at to say, yep, that's what changed everything. But, I was mostly happy in my life beforehand. I was living with my fiance. We had, the whole thing going. We had a couple of cats, and we had a house, and we had good jobs, and, everything was kind of moseying along quite nicely. And then I met my wife, and, I say I met my wife. I talked to her on the phone. And within a couple of hours of talking to her on the phone and saying, I think there might be something more between us than what it looks like, I left my fiance and we booked flights for her to come and visit. And and then the rest is history, basically. Married, children, house, all the things. Moved to the other end of the country. Recognized along the way that I'm a much better human and much better family member when I don't live near my family, and when I'm free to step away from all of the expectation that I feel when I'm there. And then, a couple of years ago, had that whole big random, guess what, you can talk to dead people moment. And, and here we are, friend, navigating all of the things. And I think for me, there's certain threads of stuff through my life that, that kind of shape how I see the world now and what I do in the world and all of that sort of stuff. And, one of them is that identity thing, trying to work out who we are and what we're here for, and feeling purposeful about life is something I really felt challenged by as a young person, especially. And, I recognize that in people around me now, that that's something that people struggle with. And so, there's that. And obviously the addiction for me was a form of self-harm to a degree, and numbing and processing and all of the things. And so that was, that's something that I also do a bit of work around now. But predominantly for me, I think it's about my connectedness to who I come from, and the grief that comes along with being human and being connected to who you come from.
And actually that kind of brings me to just jump in for a second, kind of to my next question for you around that whole grief piece, because this is something we've talked about at length, and I know it's something that you are currently working on and writing a book. And spoiler alert, there will be a book out by Erin around grief, because it is something that you've experienced a lot of. And in terms of those sort of milestones through your life, so the mental health issues, the addiction issues, was grief inextricably linked to those, or did they run parallel, or how did that connect? Because I know that you've experienced a lot of grief, a lot of people around you have passed, and I just wonder what the connection is with those and how that's possibly defined you in the world a little bit more.
Yeah, I think there probably is a link. I don't know if it's the kind of link that you would draw easily, but I think it's there. And I think a large part of it comes from the fact that I really struggled as a younger person, especially, to process grief and to understand what it is. And a lot of that is societal, I think. I obviously born and bred in New Zealand, and we're a British colony, for want of a better way of describing it. And, I don't think we're particularly good at talking about loss and grief. We don't have the kind of tools that some other cultures have around acknowledging that grief exists, or what we do with it, or how we move with it. And, we're still very much in a culture, I think, where people are seeking closure all the time and seeking healing from grief. And while I think you can heal from grief, we don't get closure. We can't close the door on grief, because once you have it, it doesn't go away. And so, yeah, definitely that has shaped my journey quite a lot. Like I lost, the first person that I really remember losing was my great-grandfather when I was 10, in my last year of primary school. And I remember going through that process and witnessing the grief of the people around me more than my own grief, and seeing how it changed the way that we engaged with each other, the way that we engaged with the people who were going through grief with us, and how it affected everybody differently. And then I lost my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, a few years later, when I was at high school, and she had been unwell for a long, long time, but her death was the catalyst for the family sort of fracturing in unmendable ways, and still now remains very fractured. And that certainly played a part as well. I was very close to my grandmother, had spent a lot of time with her. She was a remarkable woman, and that certainly I struggled with that a lot. My grandmothers and my great-grandmother were three of the most important people in my lives, and until they left. And I think that has definitely played a role. Like I said, my great-grandmother passed as I was leaving my teens, and my best friend committed suicide a few months before she passed, and that changed a lot for me in terms of my own mental health, in terms of addiction. If I'm honest, before he died, I didn't have an addiction problem really. I was much more of I didn't have an addiction to something outside of myself, if that makes sense. I was much more addicted to harmful behaviors than drugs or alcohol or anything like that. And after he died, I moved on to drugs and alcohol and things like that. So that shaped things a little bit. And then I lost my grandmother just after we got married and just before we had children. And she was probably the one other person that I knew would, like, my life path would change when she wasn't around anymore. She was like a real key figure for me, and definitely losing her changed my perspective on what's important and how I was living my life. And then we lost my mother-in-law, and everything changed again. Grief has definitely shaped the way that I see myself in the world, and how I engage with the people around me, and how much power I give them around things. I'm much more aware of the fact that I can't take people in my life for granted, but I also can't live my life for them. And I have to make choices that are right for me, rather than making choices that please other people. Because when those other people are gone, suddenly you're kind of at sea, and in a way that you can't come back from.
Thank you for sharing that, and I appreciate your candidness around, the loss of people close to you. In terms of that addiction and being able to work through it, what was the moment that it stopped controlling you and you were able to
the moment that my wife controlled me? No, I mean, I was pretty deep into addiction in my early 20s, and when I met my wife, she didn't realize the extent of it. And we were talking about what the future held, because she lived at one end of the country and I lived at the other end of the country. And, I said, look, I'll just move to you. And she's like, no, you've got a better job. I'll move to you. And, and then we had a conversation about addiction and drugs and all of that sort of stuff. And she said to me, I'm not moving to that. I'm not going to have that in my life. So you have to choose me or that. And I was like, well, that's not really a choice, is it? So the next day I went in to work, actually, and I sat my boss down and I said, look, I have a problem, and it's a big problem, and I don't know how to resolve it. And she was brilliant. She sat me down and she said, okay, I need you to be brutally honest with me. And I'm like, I'll give you everything I've got. And we had a talk for about an hour, and she went away and came back 10 minutes later, and she's like, I've just made an appointment with a therapist for you. Your appointment's in 20 minutes, so go. Wow. And and she was incredible. And I went and I set up some stuff, and there was some really painful stuff that came up in the process of therapy, that I had been using addiction as a way of numbing from, and that was stuff that I had to work through. And I had therapy on and off for probably, I'd say maybe 4 years. And, but I, in that moment, stopped using any form of drug as an addictive behavior, and then never went back to it. I knew in my heart that my wife would walk away. We weren't married at the time, but she would walk away, and I also knew that I couldn't live without her. So there wasn't really a choice to be made. It was more a decision around, how am I going to do this, and what support do I need?
And I mean, what an incredible person your boss was to do that. I mean, to hold that space for you to be able to, unload everything without judgment and without fear and of consequence and all of that sort of stuff, but to then go and sort out an appointment 20 minutes later. So you literally do not have time to think about it or convince yourself to not do it. Yeah, exactly. I think what a moment. And I think I firmly believe that people come into our lives, and we have people in our lives for certain reasons. And that just seems like an incredibly, good example of that, because until that moment, I'd have thought she was probably just a nice boss, and, you got on quite well with her. But actually the pivotal part she played in your life is incredible. But the strength that it's taken you to do that, hats off to you, my friend, for being able to work through that and to make that decision, because as anyone who's struggled with addiction knows, it's, it controls you, it's all consuming. And to be able to know that what you wanted was bigger than the addiction, that's pretty impressive. And I really appreciate you sharing that. And I'm sure people listening will really, that they're wise words, but also it's hope. It provides hope, doesn't it? If you can see someone else has achieved it, it gives you hope that you can as well.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to dive into the stuff that I just find absolutely fascinating about you. Talking to dead people, like, seriously. How do you do it, mate?
Fuck if I know, mate. If I knew that, I could bottle it and sell it, I look, honestly, I don't pretend to understand it. I don't have so for those of people listening who don't have the background, I spent 38 years of my life thinking I was relatively normal.
Really?
I mean,
I know you.
Yeah. I mean, I knew I wasn't normal, but and then I had a psychic medium reading, and it was the first one I'd ever had. And she turned around to me and she basically said, "You can do everything that I do." And I'm like, "Nah, bullshit." And so she took that as a challenge to prove it, and she did. And on reflection, after I kind of came to some sort of terms with what was happening, on reflection, I could see that there were things like when I was a really young child that aligned with what was going on. But there was a massive, massive part of my life in between those things where I just had zero awareness of it, and no, not even really any curiosity around it for the most part. Like, it just wasn't, I knew in myself that I didn't believe that death was the end of something. I had come to some sort of, like I talked a little bit before about that identity stuff, and I'd kind of come to a belief for myself around the fact that we are a spiritual being or a soul that has various incarnations as human form, and that kind of explains why some of us show up as a gender that doesn't feel like it fits, or show up as someone who's attracted to the same sex rather than the opposite sex, or like I'd kind of used that concept as a way of trying to understand myself, I think. But yeah, so then I get told, well, you can talk to dead people, and I didn't necessarily believe that. But I went along to a psychic circle, and honestly, I went along thinking I was getting a reading, and I was like, okay, cool, this will be fine, And then, and then she was like, so tell me what comes up when you tune into this person. And I was like, well, it's not a radio station. Like, how am I supposed to tune in, right? And she's like, just breathe and focus on that person and just notice what comes forward. And I immediately started hearing music in my head. And I was like, that's weird. Like, I haven't heard that song in freaking ages. And she's like, what's going on? Because I know there's something that's come up. And I said to her, I can hear Dancing Queen playing in my head, like by ABBA. And the woman that I had tuned into was like, that was my mum's favorite song. And in that moment, I felt like I kind of had opened a door I couldn't close. Like, I started to get stuff quite quickly. And, I would have, like, I'd be sitting with a friend and I'd see someone come in, or I would feel someone around, or I would hear someone's voice. And there was lots of kind of stuff coming in, and it took a little while to really understand it and to be able to control it in some way. Like, for the first little while, it was actually really overwhelming, and I had to really lean hard on some friends to try and deal with my own stuff around it. Because amongst all of this, I'm still a wife and still a mother. And my wife, I thought, if I'd said to her, I can talk to dead people, I thought she would have me in the next bus to the funny farm and, like, and basically just been like, you're not the person that I thought you were, so get out. And, I mean, that's completely unreasonable, but that's where my head was at. And, so, I was like, okay, I'll explore it. Connected with a few people, offered a few people readings and that sort of thing, and just built evidence for myself that actually there is something there. And, over time, I have moved away from it a little bit more. Like, initially I kind of immersed myself in it because it was something that I kind of felt like I couldn't turn away from. Now I think there's more coming, and I'm kind of pulling back from that a little bit to allow the next layer to come in. But it is something I use all the time, and it's a really interesting process to go through as someone who thinks that they understand themselves somewhat, to suddenly be like, actually, you understand nothing. Like, go back to school, friend.
Yeah, exactly. What are you going to be working on next? But anyway, the thing that I think I've really found interesting about where you are and what you do is the connection to ancestors. And does that come purely through that mediumship and the fact that you have a connection, or was there always something there? And why is it important? Why is it important that we connect with ancestors, and why is it interesting to you? All of those questions.
There's always been something. There's always been something. I couldn't explain it. I've always been fascinated by family, who we come from, where we come from. I've had, like, for as long as I can remember, I've like been interested in our family tree, and you know, my dad is quite into that sort of stuff, and we would have big long discussions. And you know, for those of you outside of New Zealand, when I was at intermediate, so which is like I would have been maybe 10 or 11, we did it was 100 years since the women in New Zealand had got the vote. So it was 100 years of suffrage in New Zealand. And at intermediate, we did this big project around women's suffrage and what it meant to us. And I decided I was going to interview my great-grandmother and interview a couple of other older women about how it had impacted their lives, because they had experienced much more change than I at 10 or 11. And so I interviewed them, and I remember listening to my gran and just going, this woman has had a fascinating life, and she's coming to the end of it. Like, even then I had a consciousness, you know, she's in her 70s, like she's closer to the end than the beginning. And I was like, how much of this is lost to us if we don't ask these questions now? How much of it is gone if we don't know it now? And she, you know, she was talking about her father like she had seen him yesterday, with such fondness and such reverence. And I was just like, I was blown away by it. And I remember talking to like my dad about his father, because his father died when he was a teenager. And so I'd never met him, and Dad didn't talk about him a lot. It was quite painful for him to talk about, but we talked a lot about his family and, you know, like his grandparents, and we used to go to their like ancestral home, which is, you know, down towards Wellington, so further away from our home. And we'd go, and he'd drive us past the house that my grandmother was born in, and all of that sort of stuff. And it was always something of real fascination to me. Like, I just felt drawn to it. And so I'd collect all of that information, and I'm blessed with a very good memory for that kind of stuff. And so even now I can repeat stories that my gran told me that no one else in the family remembers. And that's like a real gift to me, that I have that memory. And so that I always had that fascination. But then when I started to connect with spirit, and connect with loved ones in spirit and ancestors in that form, it all came together in a much bigger way. And knowing that the healing power of connecting with our ancestors and working with them to change our lives. Like, you know, I've always believed that we're the legacy of our ancestors, but at the same time, being able to say, actually, that legacy can be changed by us. Like, we don't just inherit it and then pass it on. Like, it's up to us what we do with it. And, you know, there's a lot of painful things in some of our ancestry. You know, you look at massive world events, you know, like war, migration, that kind of stuff. And, you know, loss of children was really common, moving away from family and migrating to the other side of the world. Going through all of those different things and living completely different ways. Like, there's lots of trauma there that we've inherited in some way, that we can choose to engage with and work with and heal, or we can choose to just pass it on to our kids. And that doesn't feel good to me. So that's kind of where my drive for it comes from, is that I genuinely believe that we are best placed to change the legacy of our ancestors and pass something more meaningful on to our children. And, you know, you and I have had many conversations about that, about what we leave our children, and how important it is for us to have consciousness around some of the stuff that our ancestors faced that we don't want our children to face. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And I think you make a really good point about that consciousness and being able to bring consciousness to the way that we look at what's gone on in the past and how we move that forward. And I mean, that is what changes it, isn't it? That's what changes the energy around it, is having that awareness and being able to do it. How do you support people who do want to make these changes? Like, what would be, if someone's sitting here going, I'd be really interested in knowing more about my lineage, my ancestors. What do you suggest to them? How do they start exploring it? What are the ways that they can do that?
There's lots and lots of different ways that you can do that. My understanding of ancestors is that there's layers of them almost. Like there's an inner circle, if you like, which is the known ancestors. They're the ones that we've spent time with. So, I'm fortunate to consider grandparents and great-grandparents and those sorts of people in there. But some people, they might have parents in there. They might have, grandparents. They might go further back. They might not. So in that space, working with them, the first thing to do is just talk about them. Talk about them. Share what is remembered of them. Look at how can I learn more about them? How can I understand them better? Because as we get older and we get into spaces that we haven't inhabited in life, we understand more about people. I certainly understand more about my own mother now that I am a mother than I would have as a younger person. And because I inhabit that space now, I can use that to reassess and reevaluate how she went through life and what her life was like, and I see it with different eyes. And so asking those sorts of questions and really just looking at, where did they come from? What did they go through? And just being open to things coming forward that you haven't noticed before. That's the first part of it, I think. It is a space for deep curiosity. It is also a space for absolutely no judgment. We don't do the work with our ancestors from a place of judgment, because it doesn't serve anyone to do that. We're not looking to judge them. We're looking to see them, witness them, and to see them with compassion, and then to take that and work with that to make sure that, any sort of trauma or patterns or behaviours that have been passed down that don't serve us stop with us. So that's the first part of it. And then, we can go back into the remembered ancestors, who are the ones that we know by name, but we haven't shared human experience with. And so for a lot of people, that might start with grandparents or great-grandparents. Sometimes it starts with parents. Sometimes it goes further back. I can go about 5 generations back because I have connection through my gran to her grandparents. So, like, in that respect, the more that we have these conversations, the further back we can go, the more information we gather, the more support we gather, because they will come forward for us when we start this work. And then, there's even further back. We can go all the way back through, where we came from. If we know, I know that I've got ancestry in France and ancestry in Italy. So I've always felt called to Italy. I didn't know I had Italian heritage until relatively recently. But I always felt called to go there. I always knew that Italy was where I wanted to go. And so it makes perfect sense to me now that when I've always had a fascination for Tuscany and those sorts of places, that's where my family roots come from. And we know that stuff innately. Like, we don't have to be told that stuff. We just need to follow the thread that we're given towards that stuff. And yeah, it's fascinating. I think start with genealogy if that's something that's more comfortable. Look at your family tree, start looking at who they are. But then be open to inviting connection with loved ones in spirit as well. You can do that through reverence practice first and foremost. We do, like in our work, we've done, visualization. We've called them in. I've read for people, called them in and had conversations with them. There's lots of different ways to connect and engage and heal with ancestors. The most important thing is that you start from a place of willingness and curiosity. And if you can do that, then the work is waiting for you. And when you're ready, you just need to dive in.
Mm. So we've got our ancestors, which come from our current human life. So
yes.
That's our lineage. What about past lives? How does that work?
Well, that's the thing, right? Everybody thinks that ancestors are blood, like a blood lineage, and that there is truth in that. But that's a very black and white kind of way to view ancestors. And ancestors, to me, are not, it's not so black and white. And I talk about the ancestral realm. That's essentially what others would reference as heaven, I think, or as some form of like spirit realm. I call it the ancestral realm because we can have ancestors that aren't blood relatives. I certainly consider my granddad, which is my dad's stepdad, I consider him an ancestor for me. I know he stands for me in the ancestral realm, but he has no blood relationship with me whatsoever. So you can absolutely have ancestors from past lives. My wife and I have had a number of conversations about a particular ancestor that comes through for her from a past life. And that's quite a difficult relationship for her at the moment, but it is something that we touch on and we work through as it comes up. You can also have ancestors of place. So as an example, I don't have a Māori lineage of any description. I don't believe I've had a past life as a Māori, yet I grew up on Māori land and I grew up in Māori tikanga culture. And so I do have a Māori ancestor who comes in and guides me when it's necessary for me to be guided, with the Māori tikanga in mind. And so she comes through and she guides me as I need it. You can have ancestors of vocation. So if someone is, working as a carpenter, for example, the most obvious ancestor to call in there would actually be Christ, who was a carpenter. And you can call him in and he can guide you as you work in that space. You can call in nurses
Is this how we kind of connect with our spirit guides, I suppose? Is that how we can use our ancestors to be that support team that we have, or that they're there? And because I think that's one of the things that I found really interesting is like understanding that, those guides that we have and kind of where they all come from. And, I certainly feel for me, I have a real mix of ancestral ones. There's a couple of angels in there. There's all sorts. Is that how you see your guides? Like what are your thoughts around guides and what they can do?
Guides, I think there's so many different kinds of guides, and guides come in and out of our lives as we need them, as they can be of use to us. So a lot of people are like, oh well, I've got this guide and that's it. And that might be true of the longevity of them, but it's certainly not necessarily true of who comes in and out. Again, my wife and I have regular conversations about her guides, because she has a team of 12 who come in and out at various times, but then she also has other guides that are more present all the time. And some of those are like her mum comes through quite a lot, and her mum's father comes through a lot. But she also has other guides that come through randomly. There's a guide at the moment who we believe is connected to our house. And, we're in the process of looking to leave our house, and we will still own it, but someone else will inhabit it. And he's been really, really present. And there's been flickering lights, and there's been doors closing and things like that just tell us that he's around. So guides, I think we need to look at them as though they are part of our human journey as much as the humans in our journey. Some people come in for a season, and some people come in for a reason, and some people come in for life. And guides are the same. We have some guides that are with us for long periods of time, and we have other guides that are only in for a very short period of time to get us through a particular challenge or a particular lesson, and then they're no longer useful to us in this lifetime. So, ancestors do play a role in that for sure. There are obviously other types of guide, like, elves and fairies and angels and all of the different things. But in terms of, like, I guess that I want to say human connection, because for the most part, people treat their guides as though they've had a human form or they're in a human form. There are definitely, it doesn't have to be a blood connection. There can be lots of different ways that they show up for us and lots of different reasons why. And, sometimes it will be past life. Other times it'll be something completely different that we can't necessarily identify.
You talk about your wife having a series of 12 guides. How can you share how people can, connect and meet with their guides, and how do they actually, find their couple or their 12 or their, what sort of things that can they be doing? What sort of practices? How do they know that it's true?
Well, that's definitely a question we've had in our household many, many times. How do you know I'm not just making it up? I think that, like, for her, starting out, it was meditation. She would take herself off on a Monday night, usually, go and have a bath, and she'd do a meditation. And she had a particular meditation that she liked that would connect her with a guide. And initially it was the same guide over and over. And then suddenly every week it was a different guide. And she's like, this is really weird. And I'm like, well, just go with it. Like, just build yourself evidence that these are connected to you. And she comes out of the bathroom after having had the bath, and we sit for an hour or so, and she pumps me for information. Like, what do they want? What are they there for? Who are they? How am I connected? Like, constant questions. So in that respect, I'm not going to come and hang out with every person who wants to know. But certainly, there are people like me, and, I'm always happy to have that conversation with people. But I think that the other thing is just being open to all possibilities around it, and not getting stuck in the thoughts of, I'm making it up, or putting pressure on it. If nothing comes forward, that doesn't mean there's no one there.
Yeah.
Right. It just means that you've opened the wrong door, and that's okay. Sometimes you open a door and the room's empty. That's okay. So yeah, don't get stuck in the telling yourself stories about it. Don't put pressure on it. If it doesn't serve you for them to come forward, they're not going to come forward. Right? Like, they are always doing things for our highest good. And in a moment where we're seeking guidance, if we're trying to call one guide through and there is another guide who will serve us better, that guide's not going to come through. They're just going to stand back, and they're going to leave space for the person or the guide to come through that needs to be there. And if we get stuck in our human form trying to control that too much, it won't work. It doesn't help us. So, meditation is a really good one. I know, Shannon, we talked to last week on the show, and she talked about her angels and how she started with automatic writing. So, you can start with that. You can start with being being in circle with others, and just inviting your guides forward, and just noticing, what you hear, what you see, what you feel. Pay attention to your senses, because they will often give you clues. Like, I have a guide that I hear something specific when that guide's coming forward. I have another guide where, as they're coming forward, I can smell them. And it's not a
nice smell.
Yeah. It's not unpleasant.
Old Whiffy's back again.
Yeah, no, it's not an unpleasant smell, but as they're coming in, I smell them and I know it's their smell. Like I just know it. Other times you just know that there's someone with you. And you know that your thoughts aren't fully yours. And, as someone who's struggled with mental health for a really long time, all of that could be really deeply uncomfortable. So be kind to yourself about it if that's something you struggle with. I know I initially struggled a lot with hearing voices. I was like, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with hearing voices because that makes me feel like I'm going nuts.
Yeah.
Find comfort with it in whatever way you can, to allow it to be what it needs to be.
Nice.
Right? Because you know within yourself whether or not that is you hearing voices that are, and spirit guides are loving. They always come from a place of love. Their vibration is love. It's not guilt or shame or blame or anger or any of those things. And so if the voices are telling you that it's that stuff, it's not guides.
Yeah, nice.
But guides will always lovingly guide you forward and hold space for you and support you. And so always ask yourself, is this coming from a place of love? If it is, go with it.
Yeah, I love that. And I guess one last question before I try and remember the questions that we ask everybody at the end of each session, which I think I vaguely got in my mind. But, you've had an incredible journey up until this point, and you're just about to set out on another incredible journey. How are you feeling about where you're off to next and all of that? And how have you just known, as long as we've been talking this year, it came up at it's probably January time, I think it would have been. How have you just trusted? Because there have been times this year where the belief that you were actually going to leave the country and all of that sort of stuff probably waned a little. How have you kept with it and kept on that journey? Apart from obviously having an amazing business partner who's really supportive and helps you all the time.
Yeah. I told you I've got two businesses. No, I'm kidding. I think I just have a really deep knowing that there is something there for us. And it is a collective us when I think about it, when I tune into it, when I, am in that space of imagining what could be. I know that it serves my wife and my children to do this. I know that it will all work out for us. I can see very clearly the life that we could have together over in whatever place we end up. And I think, I've always firmly believed that my wife and I are supposed to be together, and supposed to journey in this life together, no matter what comes forward. And the expansiveness that I can see for her in this adventure that we're about to embark on, is definitely, it's meaningful enough that I couldn't turn away from that. But beyond that, I look at our lives, I look at what we've done in our lifetime up until now, and I think it all has built to this decision. We have two children, and when Luca was born, he's the younger of the two. I stayed home with him and Asher, and my wife went back to work, and she has been in that job ever since, doing big hours, sometimes lots of overtime and things like that. And I've been the primary caregiver. But when we needed to increase our income, immediately I was looking for ways to do that without having to go and get a job. And, it's taken a while, but we've found a space where I can do work that is meaningful and work that pays the bills and supports the family so that we can do this. Did we make the decision intending that one day it would allow us to travel? Not at all. That was not even on my wife's radar, when we were making the decisions around this stuff. But it has now led to the point where actually that's exactly what it's enabling us to do. So following the nudges, right? Following the nudges and having a vision that doesn't require one outcome, I think, is probably the big key. Like we've always said, we want, like referencing this year, my wife was like, I really want to go overseas. I really want to go overseas. And then it was like, I really want to go to the UK. And then it was like, okay, but what if we went via Canada? What if we went to Canada first and did some work there and looked around there and then went to the UK and saw that as a transition point? And then, and then it became, okay, well, how are we going to fund that? Like, are we going to, is she going to take some time off work and we're going to go for a short period of time? Is she going to leap and quit her job and do all the things? And so, we've just we've been open to a number of different pathways getting us to wherever it is that we're supposed to be. And we just follow the nudges that take us down the path that is best for us. And, that takes a lot of guts, I think. It takes a lot of guts, especially for people who like to plan. Mm-hmm. But we also know that the way we've lived our lives up until this point isn't serving us anymore. Yeah. And we can stay in this space and we can do what we're doing, or we can open ourselves up to other possibilities and other ways of doing things and trust that the universe will support us. And I'm not going to lie, it has been absolutely crucial that my wife has connected in a more spiritual way with herself and with her guides as part of that process, because at every opportunity she is seeking confirmation and support and reassurance from the universe that we're doing the right thing, like sometimes multiple times a day.
Yeah.
Well, so that's
just
been a big
hats
part
off
of it.
to you, my friend, for holding that space for her, because she's incredibly lucky to have you as her partner and wife and all of the things.
Thanks, mate.
So yeah, just
Thanks.
Yeah, well done, lovely. And I think I've now got time to try and remember the question. So the first question, if I remember rightly, is what is the book you wish you'd written?
Oh, yeah.
And you've had weeks to think about this, because surely you think about this every time you ask this question.
Honestly, and this will be controversial, so I apologize if I offend anyone. I wish I'd written the Bible.
Ooh,
right? Like,
go big, mate.
right. Like, what an opportunity to shape the way that society engages with each other. Right? Like, that book has been one of the most influential books of all time.
Yeah.
And it was written by someone. Someone has recorded all of that down.
Multiple people.
Well, yeah, but you know what I mean? Like, it's someone has collected and gathered it and put it together.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know if they necessarily believed that it would be the impactful, influential thing that it has been. And I don't necessarily think that the path they wanted it to go down is the path it's gone down. But what an amazing opportunity it would be to create something that offers wisdom and truth for a whole pile of people to then go, actually, that's the truth for me too. That, I think that's,
nice. Like it. Next one.
Kino, haven't ever read it. so it's the concept rather than the book.
Fair enough. Noted.
Yeah.
Who would you, dead or alive, the 3 people you would invite for dinner?
Yeah, that's a challenging one. I mean, I think there's 3 people there's 4 people actually. I'm going to,
because it's you can have 4.
Thanks. What I was going to say is actually I would remove myself from the situation and replace them with my 4th. Because actually I would really just love my wife and my children to be able to sit down with her mum and have dinner and be able to share time, because that's like my kids don't, my eldest son was only 18 months old when she died. And so he has no memories of her beyond what we've shared with him about their time together. Our youngest son is so much like her. Like, I know they have shared time and space in the past, and in a different place. And it would just be really beautiful, I think, for my wife to be able to share them with her mum and feel that connectedness that she craves. So that would be my 3.
You're a special
/4.
person. Yeah. And then what would you like your 90-year-old self to say to you today?
Fuck yeah, you nailed it.
Nice.
But yeah, you nailed it. Like, you did everything that you were here for. You were brave, you were bold, you were vulnerable, you were all of the things that you always thought you couldn't be. And yeah, you nailed it.
Nice. And last but not least is my question. What's your guilty pleasure?
It's a hard one, eh? Well, based on our discussion last week with Shannon, I fucking love true crime. Like, not gonna lie. True crime is absolutely a thing. I also really love cryptic crosswords. I don't know if that's a guilty pleasure, but I enjoy them a lot.
I'm nerdy, so we can make that guilty.
Well, in fairness, my dad and I have long shared a love for that stuff, and that goes back further than him to my grandmother. So, but yeah, I don't know if I necessarily have a guilty pleasure so much, but those things make me happy.
Oh. Well, look, thank you so much for being in this space today. Like, I've really enjoyed. I've learned new things about you. I've been able to ask questions that I've wanted to ask and that I have done in the past. But I hope that everybody listening has really enjoyed, a deep dive into who you are, because actually you're an incredibly special person. I know that because I get to hang out with you heaps. But actually, hopefully now other people are starting to get a measure of that. So thank you very much for your time. And I think you get to do this to me next week. So yeah, I better start swatting up on what you might be asking. But thanks everybody for listening, and yeah, get in touch if you've got any questions, if you'd like to come and join us. We're always looking for people to interview, so feel free to reach out. And yeah, much love to everyone out there. Thank you very much.
Thanks for being so gentle.